Buenas, bienvenidos a este vídeo de unplandivino.net. Estamos con Marisol y Ana Pilar, Marisol de México y Ana Pilar ahí en Argentina, ahora en Patagonia. Sus voces a lo mejor suenan muy fuertes al principio porque suele pasar eso, pero luego se arregla. Buenas, ¿queréis hablar?
Hola, ¿qué tal? Buen día, buenos días, Iván y Ana.
Hola, buenos días, Iván y Marisol. Buen día, 1:15 van a estar por acá.
Sí, vamos a ver cómo... ¿Veis la pantalla bien? ¿Veis las letras bien?
Sí.
Perfecto.
Ayer nos quedamos un poco impactados, ¿verdad? Con este taller sobre el uso amoroso de la mediumnidad, que la vamos a llamar, esta capacidad de ser mediums que todos tenemos, y hablaba a través de María Magdalena, pues la que había sido su mejor amiga en el primer siglo, al parecer, y bueno, ahí lo hicimos este nuevo formato, parece que se graba bastante bien la cosa. Y bueno, como ayer, pues me interrumpís cuando queráis, incluso para parafrasearlo, poner en vuestras palabras, contar algún cuento relativo a esto, de vuestra vida, de lo que sea, o sea, yo qué sé, que nos van a contar una cosa que en parte ya conocemos, y se trata de que este chico que veis aquí es como nosotros, no es nadie, digamos, no es una reencarnación, Peter, y tiene un guía que se llama Rod, que se llama... ¿Cómo se llama? Me acaba de Angelo.
Angelo.
Aquí lo pone. Es italiano y nos va a contar, es una especie de demostración este taller, como visteis, y bueno, sí, eso. Bueno, vamos allá, ¿no? Y ya digo, interrumpir para cualquier comentario y todo eso, y me decís si se escucha y voy a ir pasando la letra.
Ok.
A ver.
Finally. It's taken a while.
Espera, ¿por qué ahora? Ah, es que tengo que poner la pantalla. Vale, es que no me era cómodo porque la pantalla de esto no está disminuida. Tengo que disminuirla para arriba. Esta. Ay. Así para arriba. Así mejor. Bueno, se ríen porque es así como bromean. Por fin ha tardado, ¿no? Vamos a escucharlo.
Buongiorno, anyway. Buongiorno. Yes. My life was very ordinary. You see celestials having grandeur in their life. My life on earth was very simple. My father was a fisherman, and you're either a boy or you're a man. There was no in between. And so for me, I was with my mother till I was 5 years old, and then I was a man with my father. He fished. Any of you been fishing? The smell of fish. The smell of fish. I did not like the smell of fish. So,
¿Da tiempo a escucharlo y eso y a leerlo bien, más o menos, o cómo lo...?
Sí, yo sí.
Relajadas bien y todo. Aquí, fijaros, o sea, es que ya no, tenía que ser un hombre enseguida, ¿no? Ese era el tema. Vamos adelante.
One day, in my village, I saw the most grand boat I'd ever seen. I was 15, and this boat was a merchant boat. It had beautiful smells. This man knows beautiful smells.
Ha señalado a este hombre, ¿habéis visto como que ha señalado a Miller?
Sí.
Sí, porque luego también van a explicar que los espíritus huelen mucho a la condición álmica y se muestra mucho en el olor de nuestro ambiente y de nosotros. O sea, como que hay más, somos más el entorno de lo que... Entonces eso.
the smells that I'd never smelt before, and they certainly weren't fish. So I say to my father, my time fishing is done. No more fishing, I am done. My mother, she was just a mother, so she fed us and looked after us. That's how we saw our mothers. We didn't see them any other way. We had to become man as soon as possible. So I just said goodbye to my mother. I am going on this boat. This man who was the captain of the boat, his name Roberto, and Roberto was the first father I had ever had. For the next 5 years, he took me all around the Mediterranean Sea. We traded here and we traded there. But what I remember most about Roberto is he taught me about stars. He taught me how to feel the ocean. These days, a captain does not know how to feel the ocean. In our day, it was 1626 when I was born, so 1636 when I first really started learning the sea, and by 1640, it was very dangerous times in the Mediterranean Sea. So Roberto was a true seaman, a true captain. He went where no other boats went. He understood the coral reefs. He understood when it was going to rain. But he taught me the stars, and I think the stars were the most beautiful thing he taught. Then, just when I felt my life was perfect and that this was always going to be the way, one morning I went into his cabin, and I'd never seen a dead person before. And here was my father, who I saw as my father, and he looked the most ugly sight I'd ever seen. His jaw was open, his eyes were wide open, and I did not know what to do. He was the first man I loved, and I didn't know how to cry. And so it was the most difficult, but one of the most important times in my life. I remember grabbing a sheet and wrapping up this dead thing who had once been so much to me. And I could not work out how the feelings I had to this man were no longer in this thing before me. It took me another 5 years to share a tear for the greatest friend I ever had while I was on earth. Anyway, his will was read on the boat, and then they said, this boat and all his belongings now belong to Angelo Rimbardi. And then suddenly a man clapped me on the shoulder and said, well done, son. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, this is all yours. And I was horrified. Roberto had given me his boat and all his possessions. So for the next 5 years, I was terrified. So instead of trading large quantities, we traded little routes. I did little short trips, no big trips. And then one day, we were near Morocco, and I was in trouble.
¿Qué tal por ahora? ¿Seguís vivas?
Sí, es atrapante.
Sí, vale. O sea, sí, atrapa bastante la. Seguimos. Angelo es el guía celestial, ¿recuerdas? De este chico. Vamos.
I had a man come up to me and say, one of our Portuguese boats has gone down. and we need your boat. This was no ordinary man. He was not asking me, he was telling me. And I said, so what are we doing? He said, you do not need to know. All you need to do is follow those 3 boats over there. And you have an order to supply, and you will be paid more money than you have ever paid. So the amount was like 1 year's work for a few months. So we arrived at the port, and I still had no idea. And then suddenly it dawned upon me when I saw all these men in chains, one after the other. They were chained at the hands and chained at the feet. And some of them even had neck collars going from one to the other. Most of them, their eyes. I always remember their eyes. So they came on my boat, 326 of them, where normally only 10 men used to live. 326 slaves were now on my boat. We had to sail for 2.5 months. The smell, you know how I didn't like fish smell. This smell was so much different. And I remember there was this one man that came on the boat. And this is probably one of the most important parts of my whole life that I did not know at the time. He came on the boat, and he had these scabs on his feet and his hands and his neck, and especially on his chest. They were like big welts, pussy welts. I had nowhere to put this man, so I put him on my bed. That was the only place that I felt was okay. I couldn't put him in my men's quarters. So from that moment onwards, he stayed in my quarters, and we treated him the best we could, but it wasn't very good. And then when we finally got to our destination, this man was walked off the boat with all the rest. I did not even know his name. I did not even know his name. Then I arrived home to my wife. I had only been married for a short time. And it was the one and only time that I ever cried on earth. And I cried and promised myself that I would never jump on a boat again. And from that moment onwards, I no longer sailed the sea. From that moment on, the rest of my life was very ordinary. But the most important part of this story is when I passed. Who do you think was the first person I saw when I passed? This slave who had been on my bed was the man who introduced me to my new life. This man, he's even more beautiful now than he was then. That's my introduction.
So should we ask the audience whether they'd like to ask you some questions?
They can.
Bueno. Seguimos, pero estamos un poquillo. Silencio.
Sí, seguimos. Como que después de como escuchar esto y las historias de Padgett, bueno, los escritos de Padgett, te das cuenta que obviamente el mundo de los espíritus funciona de una manera diferente que todavía pues no alcanzamos a comprender, ¿no? Pero pero inspira muchísimo. Y bueno, me llama mucho la atención quién lo recibió. Igual que en la historia de Paget, pero ok, seguimos. Gracias, Iván.
What would you like to ask, Angelo? Come down to inner down right there.
What condition did you pass in when you died?
Well, I was an ordinary man who did ordinary things. So my condition was not bright, but it was not dark. So when I went, I could feel my body, and I knew that I had moved from Earth to another space. So I was never earthbound. Then when I arrived, it was a state.
O sea, y dice que nunca estuvo ligado a la tierra, nunca se quedó ahí adicto, digamos.
Claro, como que vivió bien, digamos, lo que dice que no tenía oscuridad, ¿no? Ordinario, pero bien.
Sí, no era del todo oscura la condición a la que había pasado.
Exacto.
Vamos a... Sí.
Of curiosity of what this place was like. I was not a religious man. See, if you were a religious man back then and you were sailing a boat, you saw so many people who believed in God who didn't survive the sea. So my curiosity was more after factual information. So when my body arrived in the spirit world, I would be what you would call in the first sphere state. I was open. I had not been loving to my wife. I had not cared for many things. And I certainly didn't understand many things.
Angela, can I ask you a question? I wonder what changed for you after you entered the spirit world. Obviously now you have a strong desire for God. What changed for you?
Well, I blame things that happen in my life on those around them rather than realizing that it was my opportunity to do whatever I wanted to do. When I was a child, I felt that I had to be a fisherman. Then when I realized I didn't have to be a fisherman, that was the first time in my life on earth that there was a change. When I got to the spirit world, my greatest opportunity was the first time I met this slave that had been with me. Because he showed me that there was compassion and there was love in the spirit world. And I was not expecting that. And then by asking him how he could love after what had happened to him, that was the beginning of my journey. He had so much love for me, and I felt I hadn't done enough to help him. When he had died 3 days after he had arrived at shore after being on my boat. And yet, when I arrived in the spirit world, he was there as if the most gracious friend I had ever met.
Thank you.
Hi, Angelo. It's nice to see you without Peter in the way.
I just told him to relax.
Sorry, Peter.
No he visto la broma, ¿no? No sabemos. Estáis ahí, ¿no?
Sí, sí. Pedro es
Este es el chico que habla, sí. El chico, el canal, el joven a través del cual habla Angelo.
Claro.
Ok.
Que le llaman ahí en él.
I've been wondering about this, the whole process of like when we end up doing things like what you felt you had to do, of carrying all those slaves, and a part of you obviously knew it was wrong, and a part of you felt obviously probably that you had to go along with it.
Well, it's not that I had to go along with it.
Yeah, so that whole process.
The question I have for all of you is this word about death. I've been talking to Peter lots about this word. There is a belief that there's this separation between this life and next. That point.
Se ha oído un ruido gordo. Ahí, vamos.
Sí.
Seguimos.
And this man had said to me, you are carrying slaves in your boat. If I realized in that moment that if I said no, that I would not die, I probably would have said no. If I believed that. Because in that state, we're simply going from one place to another. Our journey does not stop.
Aquí puede estar un poco confusa, pero dice literalmente, en ese estado simplemente vamos de un lugar a otro, nuestro viaje no se detiene. ¿Podríais pensar en ese estado de decir no, de atreverse, de ser corajudos, decís en México, ser valientes? Me hubiera dado cuenta de que, o sea, estamos siempre, bueno, ahora lo van a decir, ¿no? Aquí pues no sé muy bien cómo interpretar eso de en ese estado simplemente vamos de un lugar a otro, nuestro viaje no se detiene, porque el viaje pues es el viaje de la vida, que es continua, ¿no? No hay separación, como ha dicho, entre nuestro cuerpo espiritual, porque ya está aquí, entonces, y nuestra alma también está aquí.
Lo que interpreto yo, Iván, lo que dice en ese estado, simplemente vamos de un lugar a otro, como que estás en este plano y al pasar a otro por esa transición llamada muerte, como que es continuar en otra forma. Pasa
Sí.
que al estar más alivianados, interpreto yo esto, lo que le impacta a él es haberse encontrado nuevamente con este esclavo y que sea él quien lo reciba. Entonces como que lo había compartido con él en esta forma y lo encuentra, lo reconoce como esa persona que fue.
Sí, y luego ya estamos en este paso adelante, que es el tema de que va a ser pues, es un tema súper importante de las elecciones basadas en el miedo, ¿no? Que ahí él, por miedo a morir, no dijo que al mercante de esclavos, o como se diga. Sí,
claro.
Este es el meollo ahora, ¿no? Entonces vamos a ver si... Sí, claro, seguimos. Y esto lo sé ahora, vale, sí, bien.
Oh, I know that now.
So what you're saying is that if you realised that you could have just said no, he probably would have murdered you.
He would have killed me, but that would have been okay.
Yeah.
And I would have been in a second or third sphere space when I went.
So you could...
O sea, fijaros que aquí da un dato, claro que él lo sabrá ahora, porque todo esto son leyes. Perdonad que haga ruido con la persiana. Eso es la persiana, no os asustéis. Y claro, son leyes. Ahora él, desde el mundo espiritual, se da cuenta de que si en ese momento le hubiera matado, pues, bueno, habría entrado en una condición álmica mejor, ¿no?
Claro, eso es...
acumulado tantas decisiones de las que ahora nos va a hablar un poco.
Sí, generalmente aquí en el plano, o sea, como la consigna de perpetuar la vida a como dé lugar, ¿no? Sin saber que todo tiene una repercusión espiritual más allá de en el momento en que haces la transición, con qué emociones y bajo qué condiciones te estás yendo. Y aquí la consigna o la percepción es diferente, ¿no? De que hay que perpetuar la vida y alargarla lo más que se pueda no importa las condiciones, y es equivocado, ¿no? Como lo estamos viendo, pero y es interesante.
¿Tenéis así personalmente, si os ha venido a la cabeza algún caso de algún gesto que hayáis hecho y decís, mira, pues esta persona a la que le hice ese bien en particular, a lo mejor me ayuda en los siguientes planos, ¿sabes? Pero que no sean vuestros hijos, o bueno, también, porque los familiares, pues hay muchas probabilidades de que si no están muy mal, pues también nos ayuden. Lo que pasa es que si no son espíritus celestiales, fijaos cómo la gente en realidad la ayuda está viciada, ¿no? Parte de adicciones, para no sentir la culpa de haberte hecho mal, pues te voy a ayudar, y entonces los espíritus se quedan ligados a la tierra y nadie sabe lo que está pasando, como vimos muy claro en el caso de la familia de Cloud, ¿no? Donde parece que lo tienen claro, que hay un gran trauma. Entonces, no sé si os ha venido a la cabeza algún caso de amor incondicional, por así decirlo, si es una palabra muy mal usada, a lo mejor, no sé.
No, en este momento no.
O sea, que vamos al infierno todos aquí, seguro.
Sí. Yo tenía esperanza en el purgatorio.
Sí, no, es que todo es un...
Todo es un purgatorio.
O sea, claro, lo que pasa es que con más intensidad o menos, ¿no? Pero lo que es el primer plano, todo lo que hay abajo, porque hay muchos planos dentro del primer plano, todo debe ser para eso, ¿no? Para sentir, o sea, para purgar el alma de sentimientos que están bloqueados en un nivel o en otro, claro, de fuerza, ¿no? Entonces al infierno en realidad lo podrías llamar también purgatorio, ¿no?
Ajá. Me tranquiliza entonces.
Bueno, pues nada. Entonces ya no sé, pues no sigamos, ¿no? Nos suicidamos para pasar en una condición ya en la que estemos, no vaya a ser que lo empeoremos más, aunque bueno, suicidarse es empeorarlo más, entonces tampoco podemos. ¿Qué hacemos?
Tampoco.
Pues vamos a hacer oración para pedir más,
sí,
más verdad divina, ¿no?
tener más fe y más fe en el cambio y en en las leyes de Dios y en que el amor está detrás. Vale, pues seguimos, por ejemplo, ¿no?
Sí, por favor.
I guess you could really feel the impact it had on your soul to go along with it. Is that...
We feel that we can't make choices when we
Seguir adelante con eso se refiere a haber cedido, creo, pues, a la decisión de subir a los esclavos y todo eso.
live on earth.
Yeah.
And this is one of the greatest false beliefs that many of you have, that you can't make the choice. You are constantly making a choice every second of every day. And it's your choice, regardless of who influences that choice. It's your choice, just like it was my choice.
And if you made a choice to honour the truth and honour love, you might have passed immediately, but you would have passed into a far better condition because you'd made the choice because you feared death.
Yes.
You made a different choice, and then, of course, when you did eventually pass, you passed into a worse condition.
And this fear of death went through my whole life, because we make decisions from that moment onwards related to that. So I used to love sailing boats. I used to love being on the water. I sacrificed that for the next 26 years of my life just because of one decision I had made.
Mm. So it was almost guilt about the decision you had made.
Correct. Mm-hmm. And as a man, you do not cry. You do not cry. That is very false, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
If I had cried, it would change many things. Just by crying and sharing with my wife meant that we lived friendship life from that moment onwards, rather than a hateful, angry life together.
So Angelo, so after you entered the spirit world, your old friend who treated you like his long lost brother, obviously mentored you. He helped you come to terms with life in the spirit world. And obviously he was connected to God, this man.
Yes.
And this had a great influence on you.
You could just see his face,
yeah,
and you knew he was connected to something that I was not.
Yeah.
He didn't even mention the word God in
Yeah.
our initial conversation.
Yeah, yeah. So what happened in that initial phase once you got to know him? You were inquisitive. You wanted to. You asked questions. What were the kind of questions you asked?
The first question I asked him was, "How could he love me?"
Yeah. Because you didn't do enough to help him.
I didn't do anything to help him. Otherwise, I would have kept him on my boat, and I wouldn't have let him go ashore even. You know, so I said, "How could he love after what had happened to him?"
And what did he say in return?
He simply said that they did not understand what they were doing. And if they had understood that love is stronger than pain and revenge and control, and that the reason that they did what they did is because they were terrified in themselves. See, even to the fact that they had them in chains, they were terrified of these men. And so he actually saw initially that we were the weak ones rather than himself.
O sea, ahí se refiere al esclavo. El esclavo desde el principio veía, entendía, el esclavo que medio curó un poco, le tuvo encamado, que los débiles éramos nosotros y no él, mano.
So after you arrived in the spirit world and you sort of were reintroduced to love in a way, that's really what happened.
We had to start at the beginning.
Yeah. And how long did it take you to come to terms with some of the things about love? Like, was it just a simple matter of going, oh yeah, I realised I was out of harmony with love there, and let's move on, or what actually happened?
As an Italian man, there's certain things that were very easy, but when it came to a woman and how I treated women generally, that took a long time.
Right. When you say a long time, if you can compare it to Earth time?
Well, for me, within the first sphere, where I was, it took 36 of your years for me just to open up to how I had treated women in my life.
Right. Yeah.
Yes. Whereas I already had this guilt and shame around certain things that I'd done in my life. That didn't take more than a couple of years.
Because they were things you already knew that you'd done wrong.
Yes.
Whereas the women relationship, you didn't know that you'd done anything wrong.
No, well, sí.
Aquí han ido muy rápido, a lo mejor. ¿Todo bien?
Sí, está bien.
Sí, todo bien.
Even how I was married, I didn't choose my wife, so to speak. It's strange because it wasn't an arranged marriage, but it was. I was a seaman. I was very rarely on land. And then my parents basically said to me, this will be your wife.
Yeah. And after you had dealt with the women issue in the spirit world, so for that 36 years later, what did you start to notice then inside yourself?
I noticed within my body, my spirit and soul, and that there was a caring that I hadn't had before. So we see love as love, but there was a part of myself that had never actually wanted to love the opposite sex as an equal, as someone that I wanted to embrace and share with me.
So after that, what then happened?
Well, after that,
was that the time you entered the second sphere?
No, I still stayed in the first sphere.
Yeah.
it was 126 years before I arrived in the second sphere.
Right. So it took you 126 years to learn, to go through the lessons of the first sphere, if you like.
Yes. And within the first sphere, as I went through the lessons, then I was able to discover more things in the first sphere.
Mm-hmm.
And every now and then I was given the opportunity to see what happens in the second and third sphere.
Yep.
But I was not able to stay in those places.
When you say you were given the opportunity, spirits lent you the power to just visit those places?
They showed me. I was able to go and visit.
Yep. Yep.
Yes.
And that then increased your desire, did it?
It was like knowing that the more that I opened myself up.
Esta línea es de Miller. Eso aumentó tu deseo de sí. Sí, fue como saber signos.
So the more that I'm going to learn about myself, and I never went to school.
No.
And the spirit world is such a discovery.
Pretty big school. Yeah.
It's so exciting to be able to learn all these things that I didn't know about when I lived.
Mm-hmm.
So I stayed in the second sphere a long time.
So you basically arrived in the second sphere, what would have been about 1700, late 1700s would have been in our time.
Mm.
And then you stayed in the second sphere for
another 100 years.
100 years there too.
Yes.
And what kind of things did you learn about there?
Well, I was fascinated about the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And in the second sphere, you have like libraries all around you.
Mm-hmm.
And
tienes como bibliotecas, no es que tengas biblioteca, ¿no? Like libraries, como biblioteca.
One of the things that happens in the spirit world is the second sphere can become too comfortable for you.
Mm-hmm.
You can lose desire to want to discover more. You're not in any pain. I was not in any pain. My body felt good. I felt okay.
Mm-hmm.
And while I was there, I didn't need to keep looking at these emotions that I had as far as wanting to discover a soulmate or even open myself up to the possibility.
Mm-hmm. So you became very involved in intellectual pursuits.
All intellectual,
mm-hmm.
Yes. And that's why I had to stay there so long.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what caused you then to get out of that?
My mother.
Your mother. What effect did she have?
She came to me one day and said, Angelo, you're a nice boy.
And you said, I know that, Mum.
I'd been in the spirit world a long time at this stage and she's still calling me a boy.
Yeah. It's a bit rough, isn't it?
A bit rough.
Yeah.
And she said, Angelo, you always wanted to become a man. If you want to become a man, it's time you let go of some of these beliefs that you have.
And what beliefs were those?
Starting with the fact that women aren't here to serve you. And she said, if you open yourself.
Sí, esta línea también es de Miller. ¿Qué ha pasado del PDF al este? No se copian bien las. ¿Sabes?
The possibility with friendship, this will start a new journey that you can't even imagine.
Yep.
So then, from that point.
Así que el infierno está lleno de, y los planos bajos de la primera esfera, de hombres machistas, bueno, también, y mujeres enfadadas con los hombres y de todo, ¿no? Ahí estamos todos. Está lleno de mexicanos.
Ahí, mexicanos y de Argentina.
Ya solo puedes
pero más mexicanos, sí.
Te puedes hacer una camiseta, Marisol, antes de emigrar, porque te van a matar, pues les haces una camiseta y decir, el infierno está lleno de vosotros.
Y ahí a la tercera esfera.
Matadme a la tercera esfera, eso, podéis matarme.
Y Iván, pregunto, él habla de su madre, se refiere a a la madre que tenía acá en la tierra? O...
Claro, sí, la madre de Angelo, y que, pues claro, ya había muerto mucho antes, no sabemos en qué condición álmica estaría, que
Ajá,
fue a visitar en algún momento cuando pudo, en cuanto que pudo, a lo mejor, no sabemos, ¿no?
claro. Siendo mujeres ya habrá estado ya en un plano superior,
Claro.
así que le tendió la mano. No, eso yo interpretaba como que uno al pasar de plano ya no tenés esos, no recordás esos lazos, pero por lo que dice Angelo, sí mantenés eso.
Hombre, ¿te acuerdas el alma se acuerda de todo y de la que salieron los cuerpos espiritual y físico son de padre y la madre, o sea que las personas que hayas conocido, ¿no? ¿Te acuerdas?
Ah,
Y además esas tienen mucha importancia porque como se nos ha grabado el alma primero sobre todo con los padres alrededor, con sus emociones también proyectadas y eso, imagínate cómo se nos quedará, claro, grabado todo, ¿no? Pero es como un amigo más, ¿no? O sea, al final, claro, ahí por eso te lo decía, que la madre ha bromeado como que la madre no sabemos hasta qué punto le trataba aún condescendientemente, por así decirlo, ¿no?
sí.
Parece
Además,
por las risas y eso parece que iba un poco así, ¿no?
sí, además él había dicho que que él a su madre era la madre nomás, nunca tuvo como que estaba para servirle, atenderle, criarle y darle todo lo que se consideraba que la
Ajá.
mujer debía de hacer, digamos, servirle siempre a los varones.
Claro, se le habría quedado muy impresa con las vivencias que tuvo durante toda esa vida, provocado en parte por lo que la madre permitió que sucediera con ella misma, que es que dejarse, como harían todas las mujeres y siguen haciendo, ¿no? Dejarse pisar, pues ella se sentiría responsable, claro, y de lo que había hecho al niño sin saber por la cultura y por todo, ¿no? Y de repente le va a visitar, a lo mejor es desde ahí, ¿no? Desde un poco de responsabilidad, quizás sin culpa ya, o no sé, no sabemos qué más interacciones tendrían, pero
Claro,
simplemente
claro.
a lo mejor para recordárselo, ¿no? Sí.
Sí,
Bueno,
sí.
ya sabes que tendrás esta creencia ahí, parece ser que es lo único que hizo, que es recordárselo.
Ya.
No sé.
Sí,
Bueno,
gracias.
pues a vosotros nos vamos a seguir. Vale.
And onwards, I started interacting with women in the spirit world that I had not even done to that point.
So did you even see many before then?
No.
No.
No, I had no desire.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So you started interacting with women, and what did you learn through that process?
Well, I learned through that process that when you're with a woman in the spirit world, that you see things with the woman. And I could see that I didn't have a match with the women that I was with.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you had basically a series of relationships? Was that how it worked out?
To start with, yes.
Yeah. But with every relationship, there was a degree of dissatisfaction.
Correct.
Right.
Yes. There was no holding of the love.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. It was like a short desire that was fulfilled and then gone.
Yeah. So what then caused you to move into the third sphere?
When I opened up here.
Yeah.
And I started to look at where things went. Mm-hmm. And there was a cord that I was able to follow into the third sphere.
A cord? You opened up your heart,
Yes.
and then you noticed this cord linking your heart to something else.
And it was a lady in the third sphere.
Ah.
Todo el cordón suena un poco raro, ¿no?
Sí,
Estamos acostumbrados a muchos cuentos de extraterrestres y de cosas, y ahora, pues, fíjate lo que es. Bueno, allí, una lady, la llaman lady, una señora de la tercera esfera.
So why's a woman that leads you?
But do you notice that she was in the third sphere before I was?
Yes. Yeah.
Sí, aquí está muy bien esa broma de siempre es una señora que ha dicho, mire,
Claro.
pero ella ya estaba en la tercera esfera antes que yo.
So she'd obviously opened up her heart.
She had.
She had
opened up her heart to me.
Yeah.
And she had known about me for 200 odd years.
So for 200 years she had opened her heart to you without you responding.
Without me responding.
And what was her name?
Gloria. We'll call her Gloria.
We'll call her Gloria. Yeah. Okay. So you sort of felt the draw from Gloria into the third dimension.
Yes.
And in that process, what happened? You opened your heart, and that would have meant then you became a lot more emotional. Is that how?
I opened my heart, and then I went straight back to the first sphere.
Okay, yeah. And what did you have to learn in the first sphere?
There was a lot of grief.
Yeah. So a lot of crying that you had to connect with. Yeah. So you connected with the tears and cried, and
then I'd be straight back to the third sphere.
Yeah. So it went like a yo-yo for a while, like that, was it? Back and forward between the second and first.
¿Allí los llamáis yo-yos también?
Sí.
En Argentina.
Acá sí
Sí,
es yo.
Spheres and the third sphere.
It'd be like we're in conversation, and then I'd suddenly be somewhere else.
So we'd be talking, and it's like you jumping over to somewhere else in another part of the world all of a sudden.
Yes.
Has visto que poca falta hace los ovnis, ¿no?
Ah,
o sea,
un salto cuántico.
Sí, bueno, si le quieres poner un nombre.
Sí.
Salto de dimensión.
So I'm wondering why you're there. Did you wonder why you were there?
Or, it was pointed out to me many times.
Right. Yeah. And then once you released that emotion, you went back to...
Well, every time you release that emotion, when you go back to your other half, it's stronger.
Yep, so you had a stronger connection?
Yes.
Yeah.
And you discover other things that you did not know before.
Yep.
So every time I release something, it's like I saw more.
Yep. And therefore had more understanding and all of those kind of things.
Right.
Yeah. Yes. So you entered the third sphere about what time of our time here on Earth?
1830.
1830. So we're now talking a couple of hundred years after, or just nearly a couple of hundred years after you passed.
Yes.
Yeah. Or is that right? Because when did you actually pass?
I passed in 1662.
Right. So we're talking about 180 years after you passed. You entered the third sphere. And
when I entered the third sphere, I was going backwards and forwards.
So sort of jumping back and forward depending on what emotions you had to deal with at the time.
Yes.
Yep. And so what happened after then? Like what caused you to discover God?
Well, I knew that there had to be something that was doing this because it wasn't me, and it certainly wasn't my partner. And that's when I met someone who was able to share with me the laws of God.
Yeah. Did your soulmate know those laws?
No,
she hadn't learned them either.
And when we listened to start with, there was no mention of God, simply the laws operate in the spirit.
In the spirit world, yeah. So you started to learn about what law caused you to jump back to the first sphere when you had an emotion.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
And laws about the heart, you started to learn some of the laws about the emotions.
Yes, and it was very important that I did not know about God first for my own opening.
Yeah. Why was that? What would have happened there if you had known?
If I had just gone straight into wanting the desire to connect to God, I would have left out these big parts of myself that needed to be addressed first.
Right, so you would have probably tried to intellectualize your connection with God.
I would have stayed in the sixth sphere for a long time.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
By allowing...
Fijaos, ¿esto os da un pie a equívoco o cómo lo veis?
Sí, pues lo que ya se ha hablado de la sexta esfera, ¿no? Con otras canalizaciones o con otras conexiones,
Sí.
de que se pueden quedar ahí pues muchísimo tiempo en la intelectualización y de Dios, pero no sentirlo. Entonces, lo importante que es ir liberando todas las emociones para dar espacio a esa parte, ¿no? Como de procesar emociones, llorarlas, sentirlas, abre el espacio para mayor verdad divina, para empezar a sentir a Dios sin tantas ideas, ¿no? Es como una experiencia.
Que le vino bien que no le hubieran dicho nada para que así él no lo intelectualizara. Porque claro, como cuando te dicen algo sobre Dios en el planeta, suele ser sin todo esto tan simple de cómo va realmente el camino, ¿no? Cómo es. Eso. Pero sí, que podía dar pie a equívoco el leer así, parece como que dices, uy, qué contradicción. O sea, él dice, me vino bien no saber nada de Dios. Eso puede interpretarse de muchas maneras. Mal, ¿no? Por eso quería, bueno, por eso. Entonces, sigue por aquí, fue muy importante permitirme considerar cómo me amo a mí mismo. Vale.
Allowing myself to look at how I love myself and that what was happening around me was because of my interactions. It was very important.
Yeah. So when you started to be introduced to God's laws, what effect did that have on you?
I got so excited.
Right.
It was a relief.
Yeah.
It was a relief. And I actually just prayed about that for a long time. It was such a relief because many of you have a feeling every now and then that comes over you, as if someone's there for you, that you can't be brave enough, or you're not brave enough in that moment to want to discover who that is.
Yeah.
I got that braveness
Yeah.
in that time.
Yeah. So we're now talking about sort of the mid-18th.
Y se refiere a Dios. Parece, ¿no? Alguien para ti, ¿no? Que hay alguien para ti ahí dentro, aunque también podría referirse al alma gemela, ¿no?
Sí.
Bueno, sigamos.
In hundreds in
Yes.
terms of Earth time,
Yeah.
and we're a couple of 100 years now since you were on Earth.
Yeah.
And then what? So what happened after that? Was it a slow process, or
No,
did you
it
still
was very
find
fast.
very fast from then on?
Yes.
And did you find yourself just flicking back, dealing with an emotion, moving forward each time now?
That still happens now.
Yeah.
So now I spend a large part of my time in the 15th sphere.
Yeah.
I regularly go back to the 13th and 12th sphere.
Yeah.
And that's mainly because my lady is there.
Is there too.
So Gloria is in the 12th, 13th sphere.
Yeah. So she took a bit longer to discover God's laws, did she, and therefore have an interest in God, or what happened there?
Well, her block, even now, is she sees God as being responsible for injustice.
Right.
And she finds that even now, that's the one thing that she's continuing to work on.
Yeah. So if she is in the 13th sphere, then surely she's at one with God. So how could she then see God as a source?
Aquí esto hay que poner ciertamente, o sea, está en unidad con Dios. Esto hay que revisar un poco más. O sea, ahí ciertamente esos son los planos celestiales, lo que nos cuenta él a partir del 8 ya es unidad con Dios. Ahí no ha dicho armonía. Y mejor decir ciertamente, ya está en armonía con Dios. Así que, ¿cómo podría ella ver a Dios? Va a decir ahora como fuente de injusticia. Y es que luego aclararán en la charla que aquí había ya distorsiones de Peter. O sea, cuando la cosa se pone ya muy, Porque aquí tiene que describir una cosa súper esotérica, que es por qué un espíritu de una dimensión tan alta, está allí tan alto, está más bloqueado que él. Entonces las diferencias, si nosotros nos cuesta entender las diferencias en las esferas de los planos humanos hasta el 6, lo que nos han contado al menos, imaginaos esas diferencias. Entonces aquí para contar esto, pues eso, no.
Claro.
Y lo aclarará después.
Bueno.
O sea, Miller aquí ya hace referencia a eso, como cómo va a haber a Dios fuente de injusticia, ¿no? No puede ser. Ya supongo que os habráis saltado un poco de la silla al leer eso, ¿no? Porque un espíritu de la 13ª, pues eso, vamos, que no concuerda. Pero...
It's of injustice.
Well, she sees the earth and what happens here.
Yeah.
And she finds it confusing often for her.
Right.
Of why we continue on earth to do what is happening.
Yeah.
This lack of love on earth.
Yeah. So she has the love in the spirit world, and she can see the love in the spirit world.
Correct.
But
she can't see the love.
So there's a bit of emotional confusion about the earth and what's going on the earth.
Correct.
And why it seems to be different.
Yes. Yeah. She finds that is where she's discovering parts of God, like within the laws. We're taught simplistically the laws.
Yeah.
And then you have an opportunity to actually understand the behind what is in the law, so to speak.
So a lot of the people here on earth wouldn't understand.
De entender lo que hay detrás, lo que hay en las leyes, por así decirlo. Lo que las leyes tienen detrás, por así decirlo. Fijaos, ahora voy a decir una cosa muy curiosa.
And a lot of the truths they've been presented with are not truths that you're often presented with in the spirit world until your development is quite advanced.
Well, in the spirit world, you generally don't want to know.
Because you're reflecting your real feelings rather than just what your thoughts are.
And
fijaos esto que curioso, ¿no? O sea, la de gente que ha pasado muriendo de la tierra que no ha oído nada de lo que nosotros empezamos a oír, ¿no? De estas cosas más sobre las leyes. Solo se les presentan, dicen, en el mundo espiritual hasta que está bastante avanzado el desarrollo. Y esto, ¿cómo lo interpretáis? Estás reflejando lo que son tus verdaderos sentimientos, tus sentimientos reales, en lugar de solo lo que son tus pensamientos. Entonces, esto es porque todo en el mundo espiritual se refleja la condición álmica mucho más fuerte. Entonces, si no quieres saber, todo te acompaña en ese no querer. ¿Vale?
Claro, en esa... Ahí sos puro sentir, no el pensamiento, que es lo que nos manejamos más en las esferas inferiores. Esto de sostener la máscara es mucha mente, sosteniendo el pensamiento.
Y te refleja mucho más fuerte lo que son tus sentimientos verdaderos y por lo tanto si tú deseas ignorancia sobre Dios, la sigues deseando, pero también es una posición muy intelectual esa. O sea, la sigues deseando porque tú cortas intelectualmente las posibilidades dependiendo de tus creencias falsas. Y por eso la gente sube a la 6ª esfera muy arrogantes a veces y bueno, pues es la 6ª esfera es de felicidad, es perfecta el alma, pero no ha recibido la relación con Dios, no lo ha aceptado el amor divino dentro del alma, ni quiere saber de las leyes así en este plan tampoco.
Claro.
Más, sí, a lo mejor solo de las leyes del mundo espiritual, pero no con Dios fuera de la ecuación. Y eso es muy intelectual. También lo que pasa es que, ¿qué pasa? La condición del alma se refleja mucho más fuerte. Entonces, si tú tienes una creencia muy fuerte de que Dios no existe, todo te va a acompañar, el entorno, la gente que está a tu alrededor, todos van a ser como tú. Entonces es como más difícil cambiar. Por eso hablábamos de de la belleza del tiempo, cuando hablamos de la compensación, del sentido de individuarse el alma primero en la tierra y cosas de esas. Sí. O sea, todo tu entorno, a través de tu entorno, tú te estás reflejando lo que son tus verdaderos sentimientos en vez de solo lo que son tus pensamientos. O sea, un pensamiento ahí de no querer saber nada de alguna cosa, pues también tiene un sentimiento debajo. Y los sentimientos en esas esferas espirituales es muy fuerte y son lo que crea, igual que aquí en parte, son lo que crea la realidad, ¿no? Como lo solemos decir. Y los pensamientos se ven mucho más reforzados. O sea, si tú eres muy fanático de un tipo de religión, un tipo de cosa, pues eso, la libertad es como mayor para eso.
Sí, entiendo.
De alguna manera. Y por otro, según como consideres la palabra libertad, pues menor. Sí. Bueno, sigamos.
Sí.
Especially in the lower spheres, most in the lower spheres have this belief of injustice of how could this be happening to them? What did they do wrong to be in the place that they are?
Yeah.
And most aren't open to hearing that.
Yeah. So when did you end up, I suppose we're now mid-1800s, there's quite a bit of time between mid-1800s and 2000, from our perspective at least, here on Earth. So what happened during that time? You had quite rapid progress. When did you actually become at one with God? When did you make this, when did you enter the gate of heaven?
So it was about 1926.
1926. So now it was, so you'd progressed from this time from the third dimension to the eighth in a space of around about another 100 years. Is that correct?
So what happens is, by spending the time in the third sphere and going back to the first sphere regularly and opening up to those emotions that I had, it meant I was able then to progress very quickly.
Yeah, in comparison to before.
Yeah.
So in 1926, when you entered the celestial heavens, what did you feel at that time? I know it's very difficult to describe it, but...
the first feeling that I had was that I was finally home.
Right.
I had finally come home.
Yeah. And you were welcomed by many spirits, like everyone is. How did you find that transition? How did your spirit friends help you make that transition over that gossamer bridge, so we call it, into the heavens? Like,
you have to go from trusting yourself and being responsible for yourself just to allowing God into your heart. And the moment you allow God into your heart, you're no longer having to do it yourself. And this was the big block that I had to getting through the bridge. Allowing myself to open up to the fact that I don't have to be doing it. Because I could love and I could share. But then when you're opening up purely to God, it's perfect.
Y aquí es eso, como que está describiendo, intentando describir la posición de dependencia de uno mismo. Tenía que estar haciéndolo. Aquí es mejor, podía amar y podía compartir, vale, la vida, sí. Pero luego, cuando te abres puramente a Dios, es muy diferente. Esto es exactamente lo que pone ahí.
Very different.
Yeah. So from that point in time, in the mid 1920s, 1926, what have you been mostly involved in doing since then?
Well, in 1926, it was a very tragic time on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very busy time on Earth. So from 1926 to 1946, I had a desire to help many people that were involved in the wars on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And that took many different forms.
Yeah.
So some of them, we probably should go back a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So when you arrive in the spirit world, within the first few moments of arriving in the spirit world, God gives you an opportunity. You have another chance to decide or change or feel open to other possibilities. So when many of these men especially arrived in the spirit world, they were given an opportunity to be shown another way that they could be engaged in the spirit world.
So you...
Aquí no sé muy bien a lo que se referirá, como que en ese momento justo del paso, supongo que siempre hay guías celestiales que intentan hacer todo lo posible para que la persona ahí no se enrede en las adicciones, pero podrán hacer muy poca cosa, ¿no? ¿Estáis ahí, Marisol?
Sí.
Y Ana.
Estoy.
Y Marisol se le han acabado a lo mejor los... No hemos avisado de que nos dijo que a lo mejor se le acababan los...
Sí, se le habrán terminado los datos.
No se podía conectar por el Wi-Fi. Vaya.
Sí. Interpreto que en esto lo que dice Angelo, viste que él decía que cuando hace la transición y se encuentra con el esclavo, interpreto que al hecho de morir en las guerras, esto de uno parecer que continúa en el mismo lugar, digamos, en el mismo estado, debe ser que por eso algunos no se quieren involucrar, siguen más conectados a la tierra,
claro.
a esta forma.
Sí, es verdad, como es traumático, o aunque no sea del todo repentina la muerte, pues hay mucha tensión. Pues cuantos más espíritus celestiales estén sin quebrantar el libre albedrío, pero estén ahí para contarles, para que puedan preguntarles al menos cosas, o para... Sí.
Claro.
Pero claro, pues la condición de los espíritus estos, para que les vean, cuando ya son de plano 8 y todo eso, en teoría tienen que rebajar mucho su condición para que les puedan ver. Y cosa que tampoco no les supondrá mucho esfuerzo, por supuesto, pero bueno, eso, claro. Bueno, parece que está claro, sí.
Mean the men who were involved in wars?
Correct.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
And so most chose not to, but many also did.
Yeah. So you would have enjoyed that process of being able to help them and educate them.
Correct.
Yeah. And
many of them were boys too.
Yeah, of course, just under 20. I mean.
Mm-hmm.
So after the war ended, obviously there were less people now passing into the spirit world than before. What did you choose to do then?
Then I went on a discovery for myself.
Right. Yeah.
And that was when I really wanted to understand God's universe as a complete.
Yeah, yeah. So when you made the transition, when did you actually make the transition between the 14th and the 15th sphere?
That was in 1986.
Right. And what was the major change in your being when you made that transition?
It was my desire to want to know more.
Yeah.
And so where I was, by opening up to this desire, He allowed me into another sphere of discovery.
Yeah. And in that case, a lot of new things were added to you.
It was like you talk about your computers, going from a slow computer to the fastest computer ever.
Mm.
Each time you go up to a sphere. So my discovery was the turning point.
Yeah. So how long now? So you've been in the 15th dimension for now since
1986 to now. I've been going between the 15th and the 13th.
Yeah. And when did you decide you wanted to be Peter's guide? What happened for you to be Peter's guide? Because that was obviously an assignment of some kind.
Yes. With Peter's guide, there's much confusion around how guides work.
Mm-hmm.
So many of you in the audience think that if I'm Peter's guide, I'm constantly beside Peter.
Yeah.
And I'm here all the time.
Yeah.
It's not like that.
No, when you're in the 15th dimension, you can share yourself amongst lots of people simultaneously.
Correct. Yeah. Yes. So the main time I came to Peter was 3 years ago.
Yeah.
When you arrived in the scene.
Yeah.
So it was that time that Peter had a desire to want to discover more.
Yeah.
And so that's when he was assigned myself.
And obviously there are personality similarities between yourself and Peter. So
yes.
what are those?
The discovery is the main one.
The desire to discover new things.
Yes. And when I was on Earth, I had many desires as far as with land and sea and understanding.
Yeah.
Very similar there. And also, Peter has a discovery or desire to want to know people.
Yeah. And
now I get great enjoyment out of just knowing people.
Yeah.
As many of you in the audience, you see all your hardships as that's who you are, whereas we get to see you as you really are.
Far removed from that person that often people believe themselves.
Correct.
Yeah. So when did we first meet, you and I?
When did you and I first meet? It's probably more the other way. When did I first meet you? Mm-hmm. That was about 14 years ago. Mm-hmm. Yes. And I met you through another celestial who took me to meet you.
Before that time, did you realise that there was any of the 14 who had returned to Earth?
In 1930, it was then that we were becoming made aware that it was a possibility that this might happen.
Yes, so you're aware that it could happen.
It could happen.
Yeah, and when did you find out that it had happened?
Well, when the 14 years ago, that was the first time I had seen it for myself.
Right, yeah, gotcha.
I saw you for myself.
Yeah.
And your lady.
And lady. And the others too. Okay, so should we just hand some questions out to the audience again? And Matthew, thank you.
G'day. I've just got a couple of questions, Angelo. The first one is for me, and I probably feel like a lot of people who are following the teachings as Jesus and Mary are giving them, that receiving God's truth is probably associated with a lot of pain. Would you mind describing a little bit of the process of longing for and receiving God's truth when you no longer have any pain? What that's like in the celestial kingdom?
Well, that word pain is a bit like the word death.
Yeah.
See, if you just went with desire, the pain, you're never going to have too much pain. Do you understand that?
No.
If you were just going with desire and love for yourself in that moment, the pain is never going to be too unbearable. Your desire and your love's always going to override the pain. Because every time you have an experience and you feel pain, it's what happens after the feeling. You know that the pain is so worth it.
Yeah.
So, no, if you can no longer see it as pain, the word pain, it's hard. going to be hard, it's going to be work, I'm going to have to fight it. The truth is, if you're feeling your emotion, there's no hardness to it. You're simply in that state rather than being up here. Is that any help?
Yeah, a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, a lot of times, Matthew, we see pain as the more important thing. And what we do there is we forget the benefits of the release of the pain. So after a while, you start seeing pain not as an impediment to your growth. You're actually seeing pain as a welcome process, a part of the process of your growth.
You know, as you're feeling the pain, that you're getting closer to your desire.
The question was about what it's like, though, to receive truth without, because it's true that as we're led by desire, we feel our pain as a matter of course, but it's still pain, isn't it? So I was interested in Matthew's question, which was, what is the experience like once you have no more injury in you to receive more? Because obviously now you're receiving more of God's truth, aren't you, as you progress?
I'm a bit confused.
Peter's confused about the question.
Yeah.
But Angelo's not.
No. Because, I'm getting really confused.
Yeah. So if I can just help Peter with the question, and what Angelo was saying earlier was that the main impediment to a person's growth before they enter the condition of abandonment with God is that they believe pain to be something that's real and tangible. They believe that pain is the reason why they can't grow. But that's not the reason why they can't grow. The reason why they can't grow is because of their focus on pain. They are focused on pain. They feel pain is more important than the benefits that come after you release it. And because they have the wrong focus on pain, before the eighth dimension, people are constantly focused on the pain that they're in rather than on the pleasure that they have of releasing the pain. Does that make sense? So why Angelo brought up the pain issue is that before the eighth dimension, you are too focused on pain still. Your pain is like, it becomes a major part of your growth because you want to focus on it. You want to say how bad it is that you're experiencing this emotion. Whereas after a while, you make a transition into seeing that it's fantastic to experience every emotion. And it actually feels a welcome relief to experience every emotion, even though there is some emotional pain in the process. It's actually a very, very welcome relief to experience the emotion.
And in the spirit world, you know that if you choose not to feel the pain, instantly you've been taken out of that sphere.
Yeah. Down to a lower sphere.
And often you might go from the fourth sphere back to the first sphere. You don't always go back to the third sphere. Do you understand?
So you instantly receive the negative feedback associated with your resistance to pain.
Correct.
Yeah. Now, once you enter the abandonment condition, what does it feel like then? And that's what Mary was asking. When there's obviously no more pain, so what does it feel like?
The feeling is that you're continuing to grow and expand.
Mm-hmm.
So every time you're connecting to God, there's this feeling of growing within your soul and understanding more of what's actually happening. So in the lower spheres, you do not have the understanding of what's happening as it's going on. Whereas in my state now, you actually have the knowledge of knowing what's happening in that moment.
So there's almost anticipatory excitement with every single thing you receive.
Yes. Whereas when I was in the lower spheres, I was simply taken and put there, not knowing in the moment why this was taking place.
Yeah. And not realising that it was because your soul's resistance to the pain that was causing you to go back each time.
Yeah. And for myself, it was generally around 2 or 3 very specific emotions.
So what were those emotions, Angelo?
Well, the first one was obviously the
women.
The women.
Yeah.
Yes. And then the second one was the lack of love I had for my father.
Right. So it's more like a resentment of your father, wasn't it?
Well, yes, I never saw my father as a father.
Yeah.
So I resented the fact that I felt my childhood had been taken away from me.
Yeah. And the third issue that you mentioned?
The third one was the love of myself.
Yeah.
I was happy to punish myself rather than feel love.
Right, so sort of self-punishment, you resorted to self-punishment.
Correct.
Yeah. Very common issues for many. Does that answer the first question?
Yeah, absolutely.
What about the second?
The second, I was just wondering, how many people are now in the celestial kingdom?
So, firstly, I'd like to ask your reasoning for that question.
I'd say there's probably going to be an emotion under there. I heard Jesus say at one point that there's now 40 billion souls, or more than 40 billion souls alive. And I guess I'm just kind of like wondering, well, what proportion of those people are in the hells? What proportion of those people are in the spirit world?
And Angelo asked you why you want to ask that question.
See, the reason you're wanting to ask that question is you don't trust God and the fact that God can look after everybody. See, if there was no one in the celestials, God can still look after everybody. You understand that?
But
so we're simply connected to helping you all as a messenger from God. But God can do that regardless of whether we are in the celestials or not.
Well, why is it though that there's all these people on the earth now that have the desire for, this is coming up for me earlier, like have the desire for the truth and the willingness and the humbleness, but they're not receiving the truth yet?
Because for many on earth, they don't want the truth around God. And they find it easier initially to talk to someone like myself rather than simply connect to God.
Yeah, I can't agree with your question at all, Matthew. You're basically saying that people on earth have a desire to receive truth, but they're not receiving it. And and that's a physical impossibility. If a person has a true desire to actually receive truth, they will always receive it.
Okay.
So this is so the question is based on an illusion that you have that there is a pure desire in many people and yet they're not receiving truth.
Okay. I think I heard you say something about it, but I must have really misunderstood.
The reality is that every single person who has a pure desire to receive truth receives the exact truth that they desire.
Like straight away.
Immediately. Yeah. Right? And if we don't, then the desire is not pure. And the issue that many on the earth who believe they're following the teachings of truth are that they are actually not following the teachings of truth. This is why they are not progressing. Does that make sense? There's this, everyone on earth wants to believe in the illusion of progress. This is a main problem we have. We want to see ourselves as progressing, when the reality is we're not many times progressing. And the main reason why we're not is not because of anything external to ourselves. Unfortunately on earth, we all want it to be something external to ourselves. That's the reason why. So we say to God, basically, I've got a good desire. Why aren't I getting what I want? And the reality is God's going back to us, well, I'm sorry, if you had a pure desire, you would already be receiving what you want. So that tells me that you don't have a pure desire. Does that make sense? That's what God is saying to us back, basically. You do not have a pure desire, because if you did, you would already be receiving what you want. And this is very important to understand. If we're not receiving what we believe, we believe we have a longing for the truth, and yet we're not receiving the truth, then it means we don't have a longing for the truth. We just believe we do. And that's a big difference to actually having one. Do you see the difference?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Angelo.
We want God to take the pain away.
Oftentimes.
Yes.
Yeah. So we want to experience less pain. Why? You're going to have the pain you've got inside of you and release it. You're going to have to experience it. So a lot of times what we want God to do is help us have less pain. But God says, no, I want you to feel the pain that's already inside of you, because nobody else can. So already we're out of harmony with the truth. So this is the problem that we have on earth. We are often out of harmony with the truth of how to grow. We just believe, we have a concept of belief in our mind, but we're yet to understand in our heart how to actually do it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thanks.
And for yourself, Matthew, you still believe that God can't do everything.
So God can give you all the truth you want, but you have to be in a place where you're wanting it in a pure sense. The instant you are, you'll get it. That applies to every single one of us, immaterial of who we are.
That's the law of desire.
Yeah.
Yeah. You want to take a break? Yep. Getting a bit of a headache there?
No, I'm just getting tired.
Yeah, all right. So Pete's struggling now, so you'll have to just take a break for a minute for Pete and have a drink if you can. I need to go to the toilet.
Me too.
¿Qué tal? ¿Estamos vivos?
Sí, muy interesante también la propuesta de la pregunta de Matthew.
Sí, ¿verdad?
Porque sí, nos pasa eso. Pensar que solo con el pensamiento pensamos que tenemos el deseo, pero la realidad
Sí.
va hacia otro lado. Este sentir que me identifico muchas veces con eso, muchas veces me doy cuenta esto de no querer sentir el dolor. Sí, está bien, tiene que doler, pero no quiero sentirlo. Y me lleva un tiempo darme cuenta, percibir eso. Que el dolor está y hago como que no me doy cuenta y busco paliativos que me alivien el dolor físico,
Claro,
sin querer llegar a otros.
También, claro, que puedes, sin querer llegar a sentirlo. Y lo hacemos también con sentimientos, que es lo que, porque parece que creemos que lo intelectual no involucra sentimientos, pero también está el tema intelectual, es de recurrir a alguna sustancia física o alguna relación con alguien, y eso involucra unos sentimientos que sustituyen al que no queremos sentir, la emoción más profunda, ¿verdad?
Correcto, sí. Sí, y es así una sorpresa, como decía Angelo, Peter, que te encontrás ahí, y en esto que él bajaba cuando estaba en la tercera esfera, que bajaba en la primera, ¿qué es lo que pasa? ¿Qué es lo que pasa, no es cierto? No era muy consciente todavía él, y bueno, como que siento eso también ahora, escuchando, viendo esto, caigo en eso también, me doy cuenta de eso, también lo que dicen del dolor, que por ahí nos focalizamos en el dolor y cuando lo liberamos, no es la misma felicidad o percepción de haber como que esperado algo, sino que nos quedamos en el dolor, sí.
Sí. Oye, no voy a cortar la llamada, sigue tú contando, porque lo que quiero es... bueno, si quieres lo voy a ponerlo para que lo podamos... Quería leer esta última parte antes, pero es que tengo que ir al servicio.
Bueno, no hay problema.
Si quieres la puedes leer tú o comentar algo de allí donde estás o de cualquier cosa tuya o lo que... Pero no voy a cortarlo. Bueno. Ahora ven.
Bueno. Sigue con inexactitudes transmitidas durante la mediumnidad. Antes de comenzar, dice, lo primero que hoy os quiero señalar es que la canalización de espíritus, particularmente de espíritus de naturaleza celestial, es una tarea bastante difícil y depende mucho de la condición del individuo en cuanto al tipo de información que se recibe. Ahora, con la canalización de Peter hubo algunas inexactitudes en la información que Peter recibió y puedo describir alguna de ellas. Pero en primer lugar podemos comentar por qué se da la inexactitud. Bueno, yo interpreto en este caso que puede interferir el uso de canal, ¿no es cierto? La persona.
Sí, claro.
Hola, ya estás de vuelta.
Ya estamos. Sí,
leí lo que dice el punto 4.
Sí, lo escuché, que lo leíste de lejos, sí. Sí, no, claro.
Tiene que ver.
La condición del canal, cuando los espíritus celestiales de plano 8 o más allá, hay mucha diferencia entre su condición y la nuestra, y entonces incluso luego comentan que a veces necesitan que haya intermediarios.
Ah, sí.
Sí, o sea que imagínate, tiene que, como otros espíritus que hagan como de canales que se queden ahí como quizás escuchando y intentando limpiar el paso entre las dimensiones. Muy gracioso, no sabemos cómo será, da como hasta miedo, pero esos espíritus intermediarios, imagínate, para que haya... Claro, porque ¿qué se te había ocurrido a ti al leerlo?
No, esto que vos decís, supongamos que uno está haciendo de medium, como que debe interferir también un poco, siendo uno de una condición más baja, si se puede decir, en algunas cosas, este preconcepto, este pensamiento, este sentir que tenemos puede interferir en la transmisión de ese mensaje.
Claro.
Como que
Sí,
uno en lo personal, en este caso Peter, como que él intervenir desde su sentir, desde su pensar, me imagino. Y el hecho de que estén otros espíritus colaborando sería como para que sostener la fidelidad del mensaje, como que le digan, sí, eso es así, no, eso no.
Claro.
Algo así interpreto.
Sí, sí. Sí, porque además ten en cuenta los espíritus ahí en esos planos de más allá del 8 e incluso antes no utilizan palabras ya ni nada, o sea que eso, y a lo mejor ya llevan mucho tiempo que ningún interés en utilizarlas ni en visitar la Tierra, a no ser que se les asigne o... Claro, y entonces por eso será que necesitan tantos intermediarios y que hay... Claro, es que son muchas dimensiones entre medias, ¿no?
Claro,
Pero
claro.
paradójicamente, luego, pues, aunque haya tanta distancia, es inmediato, es al instante y es como si fueran ellos, porque ya has visto, es como si... O sea, el canalizador canaliza también los gestos. Has visto que le ha dado una palmada a Miller en un momento.
Sí, sí.
Es que en plan muy italiano, quizá, ¿no? Eso no lo haría a lo mejor tanto. En Australia no lo sé, pero...
Claro, el italiano es más expresivo, más emocional. Pero bueno, tiene que ver también la época y esto de que se haya ido tan temprano de su casa, porque a los 10, 14 años fue que se fue a la mar con Roberto. Y bueno, eso, el tema del trato con las mujeres lleva su tiempo, sus años. Pero bueno, lo gestual sí también llama la atención. ¿Querés seguir, Iván?
Pues si tienes alguna cosa sobre la llamada o sobre estos temas, y si no ya seguimos, o sea, ya dejamos la grabación y seguimos nosotros comentando algo de otras cosas, pero Pero esto lo podemos dejar ya si no tienes más. La verdad es que habla por sí solo bastante, ¿no? Hay mucha sustancia, parece que no, ¿no? Pero
Sí,
solamente hay
sí,
unas pocas. Y bueno, y es muy emotivo también lo que hemos visto.
es muy emotivo de camino en este vídeo, muchas cosas que tengo que procesar, escribir o llorar también.
Sí, y ahí hemos visto otro ejemplo hace poco en los materiales de el LIS, que se escribe LEES, que es un canal de hace más de un siglo, también al estilo de Paget, que le vino un espíritu a darle toda la historia de su paso por los planos espirituales. Y es otro ejemplo de alguien que pasó a una condición, bueno, en este caso no pasó a una condición muy buena, pero este espíritu pasó directamente a la segunda esfera, creo. Y el que te digo, y eso empecé a leer al vuelo la traducción hecha al vuelo, improvisada de unos cuantos capítulos de ese en audio. Lo que pasa es que ahí eso se entiende peor. Y claro, es como es un libro, además lo traduzco de manera es muy literario este libro en inglés, es mucho más difícil de traducir. Y eso es un ejemplo donde este hombre muere, había ayudado a gente así desinteresadamente en la vida, pero ese hombre en concreto de este libro de A través de la niebla, que se llama el título,
Sí.
murió justo al intentar salvar a un niño de que le atropellara un carro de caballos en Londres, y en 1800 y algo creo que era, y entonces no se acordaba de nada de la muerte. O sea, él pasó directamente del accidente sin tener ningún dolor, nada, con el niño en sus brazos, el cuerpo espiritual del niño, a la esfera esta. Y es también súper emotivo. Algunos detalles del libro son súper así también.
Interesante.
Sí, o sea,
Interesante.
sin recuerdo del accidente. Que esto yo creo que tiene que ver con la labor de los guías celestiales. Como ellos pueden manejar los cuerpos espirituales y la memoria, cómo se relaciona la memoria del alma con la memoria del cuerpo espiritual y por lo tanto del físico, pueden manejarlo a su antojo. Entonces, dependiendo de la condición álmica, que ellos sabrán por las leyes mucho mejor y sabrán más allá del intelecto, desde su corazón, pues debe haber unos manejos ahí, claro, y que tienen que ver muy en general, hablando muy en general con lo que nos acaba de contar Angelo sobre esa labor de que justo en el momento de la transición, pues Dios ofrece oportunidades, o sea, las leyes de Dios a través de los guías celestiales como Angelo, ¿no? Oportunidades a esos traumatizados de la guerra o lo que fuera, en general a todo el mundo. Parece que se refería a todo el mundo cuando muere, ¿no?
A todo el mundo. Interpreto que todo el mundo, porque en la guerra, impresionante la cantidad de desencarnados ahí.
Sí.
Que todos tengan esa posibilidad es maravilloso saberlo.
Claro.
También.
Sí, de tener a alguien, por lo menos que ofrezca. Sí. Bueno, pues si quieres añadir algo más y si no, despedimos ya.
No, por mí está bien.
Pues nada, pues muchas gracias por el compartir. Y voy a dejar de grabar y gracias a los que habéis llegado hasta aquí y también si no, y hasta otra.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Vale, ya tengo ya.